Welcome to the latest updates on the U.S. Israel-Iran conflict over March 15 and 16 on the Outward Insight channel. Ladies and gentlemen, the illusion of a lightning-fast victory, a glamorous blitzkrieg that Donald Trump once believed could crush Tehran in the blink of an eye, has now crumbled into dust. The Middle East is no longer a chessboard where Washington can casually move pieces at will. When the arrogance of the White House slammed headfirst into the steel wall, known as the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the desperation of a power that had already thrown itself into the game began to show plainly. In a last-ditch effort to salvage honor sinking into the mud, Trump made one of his most reckless decisions yet, ordering a direct landing assault on Kharg Island. But Kharg is not a place for flag-waving spectacle, nor a stage for Western displays of power. It is rapidly becoming a giant crematorium where America's most advanced war machines are being ground to pieces under an unforgiving rain of fire from Iran's fighters. And while Washington sinks deeper into a deadly quagmire, its number one ally, Israel, is also trembling at the edge of the abyss, buckling under crushing pressure from Hezbollah and Hamas alike. The Middle East war has now entered its 16th day. Is this the beginning of the collapse of an empire long accustomed to bullying the weak? Why would a superpower like the United States gamble everything on a small oil island riddled with Iran's traps? And, most importantly, now that the IRGC has pledged to fight to the death to hold the line, does Tel Aviv still have the strength to weather this firestorm, or will it be erased from the geopolitical map? Today's video goes straight into the eye of the storm to dissect every suffocating development, every cold strategic calculation, and the naked truth behind the disastrous failure of the U.S. Israeli coalition to show why the American empire may be digging its own grave on Kharg Island. Before we dive into the details, please take a moment to give these Iranian fighters your likes, meaningful comments, and shares in support of a more peaceful world. Thank you so much. Trump's Thunder Plan and its humiliating collapse. Donald Trump entered office with towering ambition. He was a man who always believed that America's overwhelming military strength, combined with crushing economic sanctions, could force any actor on the geopolitical map into submission. Washington drafted a thunderstrike scenario lasting 72 hours. It was a military doctrine built on absolute technological dominance, stealth power, and precision long-range fire. They imagined a walk in the sky over Tehran, where squadrons of stealth aircraft and B-2 Spirit bombers would wipe out Iran's military nerve centers without the cost of American lives. But the calculations of strategists sitting in air-conditioned rooms at the Pentagon were completely derailed when they confronted a resilient and highly resourceful nation. The first collapse of this plan stemmed from the West's habitual intelligence arrogance. The CIA and Mossad had long claimed that Iran's defenses were little more than outdated steel relics, inferior copies of Russian and Chinese systems. Yet, within a single night, the world was forced to recoil at a dense, unpredictable anti-air shield. The Bavar 373, Khordad 15 long-range defense systems, and Iran's domestic electronic warfare networks formed a massive wall of steel in the skies. Instead of watching Iranian bases burn, global radar screens recorded million-dollar Tomahawk missiles being intercepted and shattered at Tehran's gates. This was not merely a technical failure. It was a direct blow to the prestige of the world's #1 military superpower. Trump's blitz strategy rested on the assumption that the enemy's will to resist would collapse once command centers were hit. Washington believed Tehran would panic and fall apart from within. But reality proved the exact opposite. The cohesion of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, combined with fierce national pride, created a wall of willpower that proved extraordinarily difficult to break. Instead of shrinking into defense, Iran launched a ferocious counterattack. Ballistic missile stockpiles and suicide drones hidden deep inside underground cities opened fire all at once, turning U.S. military installations in Qatar, Bahrain, and the UAE into red-hot flashpoints. The battlefield Washington thought it controlled suddenly turned on its head. America had wanted a clean war. Iran dragged it into a brutal conflict where smoke, loss, and attrition became reality. Every advance by the U.S. Israeli coalition came at the cost of expensive hardware destroyed. Donald Trump, who always prided himself on negotiating from a position of strength, now found himself facing the reality that every hour of combat was multiplying the cost, threatening both America's budget and his own political future. Aircraft carriers, once seen as the ultimate symbols of American power, were forced to pull back from danger zones under threat from Iran's long-range anti-ship missiles, severely limiting air operations. This was the breaking point in Washington's war doctrine. Once absolute air superiority could no longer be established, every plan for landing operations or ground assaults became extraordinarily risky. The collapse of Trump's Thunder Plan lies in this simple fact. Not only did the United States fail to end the war in 3 days as expected, it also got sucked into an increasingly complex spiral of retaliation. On top of that, serious cracks began to show in U.S.-Israeli coordination. Washington wanted a limited war to pressure Tehran back to the negotiating table. Tel Aviv, by contrast, pushed for total war to eliminate a longtime enemy. That mismatch made coalition strikes disjointed and strategically incoherent. When Israel's defense systems began to overload under missile barrages coming from multiple directions, real fear finally set in. Trump's plan collapsed at its foundations because he underestimated Iran's endurance and its flexibility in modern warfare. Americans put too much faith in numbers on computer screens and forgot that, in war, human will and strategic intelligence are what decide the outcome. This failure was not just a military stumble. It was a geopolitical shock for Washington. America's closest Gulf allies began to question the reliability of its security umbrella. As they watched Patriot systems pierced by Iranian missiles, confidence in Washington's protective power began to shake. Trump found himself trapped in a dilemma: retreat in humiliation, or plunge deeper into war. And at that moment of maximum tension, instead of choosing a cautious way out, the White House opted for an even more dangerous gamble by considering an expanded offensive meant to reverse the tide. The picture grew darker and darker for the U.S.-Israeli coalition. A plan once hailed as the pinnacle of modern military art had been torn to pieces by battlefield reality. This failure will haunt Washington for years to come, a reminder that the Middle East has never been a place for arrogance, and Iran has never been an easy enemy to subdue. The battlefield has now entered a new and even bloodier phase, where every inch of ground may come at an unbearable cost. Donald Trump was wrong from the very start, wrong in his approach, and wrong in his assessment of the opponent. He believed military force and economic pressure could compel Iran to yield, but the result was a chain reaction that shook the entire deterrence system. When stealth aircraft are no longer absolutely safe, when defense shields are pushed to their limits, and when the enemy's resolve grows stronger under pressure, the entire war changes. The opening phase of this confrontation closed with the roar of Iranian firepower and the heavy silence of many Western media outlets. But that was only the beginning of what came next, as the war moved into a far more dangerous stage. All in at the gates of death, America's reckless gamble. When the plan to cut off the snake's head in 72 hours dissolved beneath the Zagros Mountains, Donald Trump was no longer the confident president standing over billion-dollar deals. Before him now stood a shaking White House, a stunned Pentagon, and a Western media machine struggling to conceal the bleeding wounds on the face of a superpower. In Trump's world, retreat equals political suicide. Admitting failure means handing power to his opponents. So, instead of choosing a diplomatic exit that might preserve whatever honor remained, Trump chose the familiar road of a desperate gambler going all in. This time, he wagered America's fate on a winner-take-all operation, the amphibious seizure of Kharg Island. In the eyes of many military analysts, this was not a wise strategic move. It was the desperate reaction of a beast cornered. Why Kharg? Washington believed that, if it seized this oil heartland, it would hold Iran's economic throat and force Tehran to submit in exchange for survival. But they forgot one eternal law of war. When you strike at the lifeblood of a nation, you are not just confronting an army, you are confronting the survival instinct of an entire people. The United States mistook Kharg for an easy prize, a Middle Eastern Pearl Harbor waiting to be subdued by marine power. The recklessness began with moving carrier strike groups deep into the Strait of Hormuz, waters Iran has long called the graveyard of empires. Despite stern warnings from seasoned generals about sending tens of billions of dollars worth of warships into the range of thousands of coastal missiles, the order from the White House did not change. Trump needed a theatrical victory, an image of the stars and stripes flying above Iran's oil tanks to calm a furious public. That decision pushed tens of thousands of U.S. troops into a nightmare scenario. This was no longer war fought remotely behind computer screens. This was a life-and-death confrontation against fields of missiles and suicide drones waiting to crush the invader. Washington's next great mistake was underestimating Iran's asymmetric warfare, while massive U.S. landing ships advanced slowly. Beneath the waves and along the coast, the IRGC's swarms of armed speedboats had already formed like hunting sharks. With Iran's air defense network still intact and the skies nowhere near secure, American assault forces immediately became enormous targets at sea. But the blindness of Washington's hawks smothered reason. They believed that once troops got on the island, ground firepower would solve everything. That, too, was a deadly illusion. Kharg was not just an island. It was a steel fortress, reinforced over decades, webbed with underground tunnels, with every meter seeded with mines and death traps. And while America poured its energy into this inferno, its ally Israel was falling into an even greater tragedy. Tel Aviv realized that America's security umbrella was busy trying to rescue its own honor and no longer had the strength to shield its closest ally. Trump's recklessness on Kharg inadvertently set the entire resistance axis ablaze. Hezbollah, Hamas, and Iran-backed forces in Iraq and Yemen all increased pressure, turning Israel into a lonely island in a sea of fire. Netanyahu cried out for help, but the answer from Washington was increasingly hollow promises, as most military resources had already been thrown into the Kharg gamble. This was the beginning of the chain collapse the world is now witnessing. The White House's recklessness was also evident in its dismissal of warnings from both European and regional allies. Many Gulf states, sensitive to the smell of gunpowder, quietly stepped back and refused to let the United States use their bases for direct strikes on Iranian territory. Trump was slowly becoming isolated within his own coalition, yet the man who once styled himself as the master negotiator would not stop. He believed that one powerful enough blow at Kharg would restore order. Reality was colder than that. The deeper America went, the more it lost strategic initiative. Every step toward the island was also a step closer to the abyss of global reputational decline and economic pressure. Looking back through history, it is rare to see America trapped in such an awkward position. A president consumed by power, a military machine dragged forward by flawed assessments, and a war objective growing more obscure by the day. Kharg was no longer just a military target. It had become a symbol of defiance against unipolar power. America was entering a contest whose rules it did not fully understand, facing an opponent unwilling to yield under pressure. This reckless plunge would not bring an easy victory. It would only bring flag-draped coffins back to Dover in silence. And the Kharg gamble also exposed the limits of modern military technology when confronted by human resolve. Advanced armor, smart rifles, and cutting-edge drones become fragile things on a battlefield Iran has prepared centimeter by centimeter. Iranians do not fight with algorithms. They fight with faith and with the continuity of their nation. Trump's mistake was trying to crush spirit with material strength, a mistake many empires made before they declined. The battle opened with images of the first American units stepping onto Kharg's beaches beneath thunderous artillery. The screams of soldiers mixed with missile blasts, creating a vision of hell on earth. Washington had entered the gate of death, and now no longer had the right to choose how the game would end. The fate of American power and the survival of Israel now hung suspended in the gun barrels of Iran's defenders. The battle for Kharg had only just begun, and the price of this gamble could far exceed every initial calculation. Trump had thrown the spear, and now he was forced to follow it to the bitter end. The world is holding its breath not to see how America wins, but to see how a superpower tries to bend fate in the face of Iran's strength and iron resolve. Kharg turns into a furnace of death. Dawn over the Gulf these days is no longer the calm blue of the sea. It is nothing but the blazing red of war smoke. When Donald Trump ordered carrier strike groups to close in on Kharg Island, he personally flung open the gates of hell for tens of thousands of American troops. The amphibious operation that had been promoted as a symbol of unstoppable U.S. Marine power quickly turned into a horrific disaster where Pentagon pride was shredded under Persian artillery and missile fire. Kharg was not merely an oil island. It had become a fortress of death, a colossal trap prepared to crush anyone reckless enough to come near it. The battle began in chaos, rarely seen in modern war, as CH-53K King Stallion transport helicopters and V-22 tiltrotors lifted off from amphibious assault ships. They were immediately met by a suffocating wall of low-altitude air defense. Without flashy radar displays, thousands of fighters emerging from caves and tunnels used shoulder-fired missiles and optically guided anti-aircraft guns to tear apart America's million-dollar aircraft in the sky. The image of helicopters burning and plunging into the sea became brutal proof of the collapse of America's airborne landing doctrine. The United States had put too much faith in remote support fire, only to watch its best-trained troops die before they could even set foot on the sand. Beneath the surface, the situation was even darker. LCAC hovercraft, once celebrated as symbols of American naval mobility, became targets for Iran's suicide speedboat teams. Using fluid wolfpack tactics, hundreds of small boats armed with short-range anti-ship missiles and torpedoes slashed into the U.S. fleet formation like knives. At the gateway to the island, no Aegis system and no phalanx gun could handle hundreds of fast, small, reckless targets at once. Explosions shook the sea non-stop. Black smoke blocked out the sun. Beneath the dark water lay the wreckage of modern warships and advanced equipment, evidence of a catastrophic miscalculation. When the first units lucky enough to survive reached shore, they realized the real nightmare was only beginning. Kharg's beaches were not the picturesque shoreline of an easy landing. They were a maze of mines, traps, fortifications, and sniper barrels hidden behind giant oil tanks. AI-assisted systems and expensive exoskeleton gear suddenly became burdens as American soldiers dragged themselves through mud and slick oil. To the shriek of incoming mortars, Iran had transformed the entire oil infrastructure into a lethal, defensive battlefield. Every pipeline, every pumping station, every industrial structure became a hardened strongpoint. From vast tunnel networks below ground, Revolutionary Guard fighters appeared and disappeared like ghosts, launching flanking strikes that shattered Marine formations and severed all communication with command. The savagery of the Kharg landing also lay in the fact that Americans were effectively blinded. GPS was jammed on a wide scale. Satellite communications became useless in the face of electronic warfare capabilities Iran had quietly developed over many years. American soldiers fought in a state of extreme confusion. They did not know where the enemy was, yet bullets and fire rained down from every direction. Meanwhile, Iranian observers on the mainland continuously directed terrifyingly accurate short-range ballistic missile fire. Fateh 110 missiles slammed into landing zones, turning every U.S. attempt to establish a forward operating base into dust. There was no shelter, no retreat. American troops could only look at one another as despair grew by the hour. This was the blood-soaked scenario many strategic analysts had warned about. Donald Trump had sent his army into a war that could not be won with firepower alone. On Kharg, Iran was fighting not just with bullets and explosives, but with resolve accumulated over decades, with the spirit of a nation that refuses to kneel. Every patch of ground on that island became a place where the invaders' ambitions were buried. And with every passing hour, the casualty lists sent back to Washington grew longer, to the shock of the American public. America's superpower status was being buried under the rubble of shattered oil piers and collapsed infrastructure. The defeat on Kharg also brought an even heavier consequence. It exposed the U.S. military's confusion when facing a people's war fused with modern technology. As videos of destroyed American hardware and scenes of retreat spread across the world through social media channels linked to the IRGC, the White House's prestige began collapsing frame by frame. The world is now witnessing an undeniable reality. America's aura of deterrence has been broken in the Gulf. Trump, instead of securing a spectacular triumph for the history books, now faces the biggest military earthquake in decades. The scene closed with the thunder of Iran's final evening barrages and images of the U.S. fleet forced to withdraw farther offshore. Kharg still stood amid the smoke, a symbol of Iranian resilience and the grave of Washington's imperial illusion. IRGC's thunder falls across the Middle East. When the dust of the first airstrikes began to settle, the world was shocked to discover a reality opposite everything the West had predicted. After decades of sanctions and sabotage, Iran's military capabilities had not weakened. They had evolved far beyond the calculations of Western intelligence. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps does not fight in the old conventional style of rigid formations. It fights with asymmetry, with flexibility, with a fusion of infantry endurance and domestic technology honed through years of siege. Iranian resistance on Kharg and across the wider front was no accident. It was the product of a sophisticated depth defense strategy that turned every inch of land into death ground for expeditionary forces. One of the sharpest weapons in the IRGC's arsenal was its suicide drone matrix. While the U.S. military still relied heavily on large radar-dependent systems, Iran launched wave after wave of Shahed 136 and Arash drones from hidden launch areas disguised under sand and concrete. Flying low over the sea like invisible blades, they formed steel swarms that closed in on U.S. warships. Iranian guidance systems allowed these cheap devices to hunt down command centers and fire control radar clusters aboard destroyers. Washington might shoot down dozens, but stopping hundreds at once was another matter. This was a direct strike at the Pentagon's wallet. $1 million interceptors spent to destroy drones worth only tens of thousands. At the same time, underground missile cities deep inside Iran came to life. While America and Israel bombed known coordinates, Iran's real power remained protected beneath hundreds of meters of rock. Short-range ballistic missile systems like Fateh 110 and Zulfahar needed no permanent launch pads. They emerged from hidden silos, fired, and vanished back underground before U.S. satellites could lock on. That mobility transformed the whole of Iranian territory into a giant launch platform nearly impossible to neutralize. Every time an IRGC missile streaked into the sky, it carried not only explosives, but a declaration of Tehran's deterrent power. Repeated strikes on logistical sites in Jordan and Saudi Arabia disrupted supply routes to U.S. landing forces on Kharg and deepened American difficulties. That resistance was also strengthened by a digital guerrilla network. Iran proved it could fight in modern electronic warfare, repeatedly jamming and even seizing control of some U.S. reconnaissance drones, turning them into sources of misleading data sent back to the Pentagon. When deprived of its observational advantage, the world's largest military suddenly became clumsy in the face of Persia's complex battlefield design. But, above all, Iran's greatest weapon was still the spirit of the Revolutionary Guard fighters. They fought for belief, for oath, for the defense of their homeland. On Kharg, many units accepted deadly missions to stop amphibious assault groups, while snipers waited in silence for days for decisive moments. That iron resolve is something no Western supercomputer and no AI model can truly simulate. Iran's resistance on Kharg sent a shattering message. The era in which great powers could use carrier fleets to impose their will on the Middle East is nearing its end. Washington misjudged Iran's internal strength when it assumed maximum pressure would crush the country. In reality, that pressure forged something even harder. The combination of long-range missiles, suicide drones, underground warfare, and human tenacity created a defensive system extraordinarily hard to break. The deeper Washington pushed, the more ferocious Iranian counterstrikes became, turning every day in the Middle East into a greater burden for the coalition. One fact is now coming into view. America is struggling to find a weak point in Iran's defense architecture. Many Pentagon war scenarios have had to be rewritten. And while the IRGC's resilience is holding Kharg, it is also opening the door to deeper geopolitical change. Israel trembles as the Iron Dome turns to scrap, while the U.S. military was being pulled into the furnace of war at Kharg. On the Western Front, its closest ally, Israel, was facing an existential crisis unlike anything since the country's founding. Tel Aviv's fateful mistake was its near-total dependence on Washington's security umbrella and its blind faith in the myth of the Iron Dome's invincibility. Now, with the United States busy struggling in its own war, Israel has been left inside a rising firestorm coming from all directions. The so-called security fortress of the Jewish state began cracking under the suffocating pressure of the Iran-led resistance axis. The tragedy exploded when Iron Dome, once glorified as a sacred shield of technology, was finally overwhelmed by saturation attacks coordinated by Hezbollah and Iran. Instead of launching single missiles that were easy to intercept, resistance forces unleashed mass barrages of rockets, cruise missiles, and suicide drones hour after hour. Israel's defensive supercomputers rapidly entered overload and paralysis. As Tamir interceptor stockpiles drained faster than they could be replenished, the skies over Tel Aviv, Haifa, and Jerusalem became vast open space, with no true shield left above them. Iranian medium-range ballistic missiles began piercing the defense grid and striking command centers, power plants, and critical strategic infrastructure. Images of shaking buildings and destroyed air bases, once considered untouchable, erased the myth of an Israel that could never be defeated. And Israel was not only under pressure from above, it was also being crushed by an ever-tightening geopolitical vice. On the northern border, Hezbollah had deployed its elite Radwan forces, ready for a large-scale cross-border operation. In the south, armed groups in Gaza and the West Bank launched continuous raids, forcing Israel to spread its forces across too many fronts. The consequences were not confined to the battlefield. They were spreading deep into Israeli society itself. The economy began seizing up as seaports were blockaded and trade stalled. Long lines of evacuees at airports and border crossings reflected a level of panic rarely seen before. Netanyahu's government was becoming increasingly powerless under the security earthquake as every hardline statement rang more hollow than the last. Israel's trembling carries symbolic weight. It marks the failure of Western military thinking in the Middle East. They believed cutting-edge technology could replace strategic depth and regional political strength, but when U.S. carriers were forced to retreat before Iranian anti-ship missiles, Israel bitterly realized that it was only a small piece on a much larger global chessboard. Diplomatic isolation became increasingly visible, as even countries that had signed the Abraham Accords began keeping their distance to avoid being dragged into the war storm. At this point, Israel resembles a fortress burning in the desert, short on reinforcements, short on allies, and short on time to repair years of accumulated strategic mistakes. Night fell over Tel Aviv with endless air raid sirens, packed shelters, and a sky still shaking from incoming missile strikes. A military power that once projected force across the Middle East now trembles on the edge of total collapse, as Iron Dome is reduced to useless metal against Iranian firepower, and Washington is dragged too deep into Kharg to pull itself free. The fate of this alliance is now being written in red streaks across the Middle Eastern sky. This is no distant prediction. It is the brutal reality unfolding before the world's eyes. The era of imposing order by military force and clinging to fantasies of invincibility is entering its final chapter in the smoke of war. America falls before Iran's iron will. The failure of the U.S. Israeli coalition in recent days is not merely a matter of manpower losses or destroyed equipment. More deeply, it is the collapse of a military doctrine overly dependent on cold technology and lifeless algorithms. The Pentagon and Mossad placed far too much faith in the idea that advanced AI systems and supercomputers processing billions of data points per second could replace human instinct and battlefield adaptability. They entered this war like laboratory engineers, only to be struck senseless by Tehran's strategic mind. Iranian military planners proved that, in the art of war, iron will and practical strategic thinking are what shaped the battlefield. America's first mistake was complete reliance on AI-driven target recognition. U.S. surveillance systems scanned Kharg Island and Iran's borders in microscopic detail, mapping positions down to the centimeter through heat sensors and ground-penetrating radar. But artificial intelligence can only analyze what it is programmed to see. Iran, by contrast, mastered camouflage and deception. It built thousands of decoy targets from composite materials that emitted heat and electronic signatures resembling real missile launchers. The result was that expensive U.S. missiles were wasted on empty mock-ups, while the real IRGC arsenals remained safe deep inside limestone caverns, hundreds of meters underground. That vast waste did not just drain the war budget. It pushed American algorithms into a kind of battlefield hallucination, producing flawed assessments of Iran's actual strength. The next failure came in electronic warfare. The Pentagon once boasted it could blind any military by collapsing communications networks, but Iran had prepared for that scenario over decades. Instead of relying on a centralized network easily destroyed, the IRGC built a distributed communications system, combining modern encryption with flexible methods of message transmission that U.S. AI systems could not crack in real time. Thank you for joining Outward Insight as we follow and analyze these suffocating developments. The truth is sometimes harsh, but it is the truth that helps us understand the nature of our times. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to continue following the sharpest and most hard-hitting geopolitical analysis on the channel.